We are going to attach our closures to the little bodice front that you've made in class. The directions to this are in eCollege, and we have stepped through them in class. If you have any questions, please let me know so I can help you figure this out. When we are sewing on closures, these are things we want to stay on very, very securely. So in everything that we sew on for a closure, we will have 12 threads ultimately through each eyelet. The eyelets are the holes. So you can see on this button how it has 4 holes. Each one of those is called an eyelet. So by the time we're done, each eyelet will have 12 threads going through each hole. 12 is a lot, especially if you're thinking of 4 holes in a button. So what I do is to actually stitch with 4 threads. The way I do this is to create a thread that's twice as long as what I normally stitch. Now remember, you normally stitch with it being from your fingertips to your nose. That's approximately a yard on most adult people. But this time we'll do your whole wingspan. So I have a very, very long piece of thread here. What I'm going to do is actually put the ends together. And you can thread these ends through, or what I have found is sometimes easier for students is to go to the other end where we have a loop and make it a sharp crease. So stick your needle in there and pull on the end of that thread really tight. Hold it in place as you slide the needle out, and then thread that loop through your needle. If you bring the loop together with the other 2 ends you have, now we have 4 threads. I'm going to actually do my dressmaker's knot in my loop and my 2 ends. So I hold it between my thumb and finger, wrap it around higher, hold down, roll off my finger, and then slide the loop down. This makes a huge knot because I have 4 threads going together. But because I'm stitching with 4 threads, this means that I only have to take 3 stitches to get my 12 threads in each eyelet. Now, for a women's shirt, the closure closes right over left. If I'm looking at it in front of me, that means it's a mirror image. So it would close right over left. So my closures that are on the base would be on the left side, and my buttonholes and other hooks would be on the right side. For the buttons, you will actually have 2 buttons. One button will be cantankerous and not want to get on here. One button will be a sew through button. That means we will actually stitch through the button. And one button will have a shank on it. So that little loop is a shank. We're going to attach the buttons, both buttons, the exact same way. For all of these closure devices, I want you to start with a waist knot. So put a nice big dressmaker's knot in the end of your thread, and then start about a ½ inch away from where you actually want the button to go. The buttons should be the diameter of the button away from the front edge. That way, when it's closed, we won't see skin on this side of the button. So ultimately, you will have the radius of the button and the radius of the fabric here. Now again, as we talked in class, sometimes if you have like an inch button, that can be too far over and you need to adjust. At minimum, we need an 1/8 of an inch away from the edge of the fabric, or the front of your garment. So if I start out here a ½ inch away, what I want to do is to come up what is ultimately the radius or the diameter of the button away. With this waist knot, come on, I'm actually stitching, well, nope, that's not. I'm stitching in between the layers. So you don't see the stitches on the back side or on the front side. And I'm the diameter of the button away from the edge of the garment. So this is where I want to stitch. I'll pull through, and the thing about stitching with 4 threads is every stitch you take, you have to make sure all 4 threads are with you. if you need, get some beeswax and smooth out your thread. At that point, I'm going to take a little tiny foundation stitch, and that it does go through all layers so that I'm getting the reinforcement of the interlining. And now I'm ready to stitch my button on. So I'm going to come up through the bottom of the button and down through the top of the button. Now at this point, I don't care if you want to make two little bars, if you want to make a box, if you want to make an X, however you want to do it is fine. What I care about is that we have the 12 threads going through each hole. The other thing we need to make sure is that our stitches are coming up and down in pretty much the same spot. That will keep our shank nice and thin so that the buttonhole closes around it. This time you can stitch all the way through and we'll come back up. Now, what we need to make sure is that we have room for our shank. So there needs to be a difference between the bottom of the button and the fabric. One way that you can do this is to use the tip of your scissors and slide it under there in your stitch. Sure thing. And just make sure that the stitches go over the tip of your scissors every time. Another way is, especially if your button has ridges on the top, is to slide a pin underneath the stitches on the top, and then when you pull the pin out, you will have some relief and room for your shank on there. When I come back up from the bottom, I'm going to try to keep my stitches again close to the same spot. It's okay if we have a few stitches back here. That gives us the strength of the interlining, but we want to make sure that we don't have a big garbly goop. So every time you pull through, look on the back side and make sure all 4 threads are with you. Then I'm doing the 2-bar method, so I'm going to go back down through the bottom of the button and try to keep my stitches once again pretty much in the same spot, maintaining the room for my shank all the time. I'm going to repeat this process until I have my, in this case, 3 stitches or 12 threads through each eyelet. This is probably one of the most practical things I can teach you, because at some point a button's going to fall off. So if you can put it back on, you can save the day, or maybe yourself a lot of embarrassment. And one more. So see, I needed to make sure all those threads came through, so I had to look and pull again. Okay, now I have a pretty big thickness of thread going through my button. So I know that I have 12 threads through each eyelet of that button. I'm on the back side of my fabric. On the back side you just see some small little stitches there, so that everything is secure, but it's not a big mess on the inside of my garment. Now what we need to do is create the shank. So I'm going to stitch this time up from the bottom, but I'm coming up underneath my button. I don't go through the button, underneath. Remember, the shank allows the other piece of fabric to sit flat underneath the button and on top of your garment. It also strengthens the button. So once I'm underneath the button, what I'm going to do is wrap my shank 4 or 5 times to keep it nice and strong. Then what I want to do is take a small stitch right at the base of my shank. That just kind of holds everything in place, and do a nice little tailor's knot. So big circle, come up through the circle and hold it down. Again, if you need to, put your needle in the center of your circle and poke it down right there by where you took your small little stitch, so that the knot will secure right there. Then right where that knot is, you're going to take another stitch out to the middle of no man's land, and this stitch once again, if I can get it, should be in between the layers. So we don't see these big stitches on the back side of the garment either. Then we can clip those threads off. And we can clip the waist knot off. So here's our button, and we see just very few extra stitches other than those required to hold it on. The shank button goes on much the same way. So I'm going to start with another dressmaker's knot, like we've described before, and I'm going to do a waist knot in between the layers and come out about the diameter of the button away. I'm going to do my foundation stitch again, and now proceed to stitch through the button. Because this has a shank, I'm just going through the shank and back down. We are going to wrap a thread shank as well because it not only gives it room like this one, but it gives it strength. So we're going to leave just a tiny little bit of space in between the bottom of the shank and the fabric. Now typically you would be using a shank button on something that has a little more texture or weight to it. A lot of times jacket buttons have shanks on them, but something with a little more substance so that it doesn't seem like you have this big button hanging on lightweight fabric. There are some decorative buttons that have shanks, but we need them not only for the space that they provide, but we need them for strength. Okay, so once I have done my 3 stitches or 12 threads, if you find stitching with 4 threads just gets knotted and is too hard, just double your thread over and just stitch with 2. But then you need to take 6 stitches in everything instead of 3. 12 threads is our goal. So I'm coming back up, this time underneath the button, and I'm going to wrap just the thread, because that's what gives it strength, right? Wrapping the metal or the plastic shank doesn't give us any strength. Wrapping the thread gives us strength. And just like before, I take a small stitch. Now my threads are getting pretty short here. Let's see. So what I'm going to have to do is actually cut it and then make my knot. If you end up making a square knot like you're tying your shoe, we have to make 2 of those. Unlike your shoe, 1 is not strong enough. So we do that twice. And then what I can do is to thread it up. So I'm actually going to take my stitch right now with my needle. And then thread these through and take that final stitch. Maybe. There's 2 of them. Okay, so this part we can edit. So I'm going to thread them up, take my big stitch in between the layers, and pull them through. And then I can clip both my thread and my waist knots. And we have both a sew through and a shank button attached to our garment. Now, because this is the underside of the garment, we will be sewing excuse me, the eyes of the hooks and eyes on the underside. You will have one of these. So you will either have the curved eye or the straight eye. The curved eye is intended to stick out from the edge of the garment, like so that when the hook comes and hooks, the 2 edges can abut together, or just meet up. The straight eye is intended for when you want them to overlap. So it lines them up to where you want to lap the garment over. They're sewn on the exact same way. Yeah. So most of the stitches from here on out are the same way. The difference is going to be that the button is the only thing that gets a shank. Everything else is sewn flat down to the garment because it's actually shaped to be sewn flat. All right, so I have my 4 threads. I'm going to do my dressmaker's knot, circle, pull down, and then I have my big old knot to be a waist knot. 1/2 inch away from where I want my eye to be, and then come up and take a foundation stitch. Then we're going to go through this eyelet to the outside 3 times. And I usually take this as 1 stitch. So I go through both layers and back up through the eyelet, and around my button. I wouldn't suggest around your button. Okay. Make sure all 4 threads are with you, and do that 2 more times. Just right in the right spot for me. And then this time when I go through, what I'm actually going to do is to go in between the layers, so you don't see my needle on this side, and I'm going to come up where I want to stitch down the other eyelet. So I'm going to come up through the eyelet and take 3 stitches through this eyelet. You can go all the way down and all the way back up. Again, try to keep your stitches all together in the same spot so we don't have a bunch of garbly goop. And see how my thread looped there? So I want to make sure I get it pulled down flat with everything else. When I've taken my 3rd stitch, what I'm going to do is take a small stitch here on the outside, do my dressmaker's knot, or tailor's knot, sorry. And then stitch right from where that knot is, in between the layers. Is that in between? Where I can clip off the thread and the waist knot. So this is the straight eye. Now probably a lot of you have actually worn garments with the curved eye. Again, you will have one or the other, so you won't have both on your sample. The sets don't come with enough for everybody to have both. So, with this one, it needs to hang off the inside of the garment so that when the 2 edges abut or come together, you don't have the hook and its stitches, or the eye and the stitches hanging out. It's all tucked to the inside of the garment. So I'm going to do my 4 threads again, and I'm going to tie my loop and my ends together in one big dressmaker's knot, and this time I'm going to start on the inside of the garment. This is all on the left side of the garment. So I want it to hang off about like that. So I'm going to come, again, approximately 1/2 inch away and come up where I want to start sewing the first eyelet. I'm going to take my foundation stitch and now I'm going to start stitching the eyelet down. And you guessed it, 12 threads through this one as well. This time I don't want my stitches to come through to this side. Remember, our interlining is on this side, so we just need to catch the strength of that to be able to hold this in place and secure. And on the third stitch I can go in between the layers over to the other side, no stitches on the front side, and through that eyelet. Oops, I'm getting a little whopper tub. Through that eyelet 3 times. And then take my little stitch outside, tie a knot, tailor's knot this time, in between the layers, back out, always good to check, and clip off my threads and my waist knot. And another little thread. Now again, you will have either this, the curved eye or the straight eye. The curved eye is intended to let the two pieces abut, what we say, or line up next to each other. The straight one is to allow it to overlap. Now there's one more eye that we can use, and we do this one because it closes with the hook more securely, and it is quite a lot of work. I have put an illustration of this in Doc Sharing, just like all the other stitches, and this is called a thread eye or a thread bar. This technique can be used for multiple different things besides just a thread eye. If you have a lining that you want to hang free from your garment, you can use a thread bar to attach it. If you want belt loops that are not very obvious, you can use a thread bar for that. So anything that needs to attach can use a thread bar as well. But for hooks and eyes, they close much more securely. So you could have a curved eye, you could have a straight eye, or you could have what we're about to create, which is a thread eye. Again, we're going to start with our waist knot and come up right where we want to start our thread eye. The thread eye could be used curved or it could be used straight, so we can substitute for either one. We're going to do it straight because that's a little bit easier. Now this time what I'm going to do is come a good 1/4 of an inch away from my first, oh wait, sorry, forgot the foundation stitch there. Do my foundation stitch. I know you would have caught that on your own. I have one little loop here, so I want to pull him up so everybody's even. Now, about a 1/4 of an inch away from where I stitched there, if you can catch the interfacing for support, that's great. And then I'm going to come right back up. I felt it on the back side that I was catching too deep there. So I don't have these stitches on the back side of my garment. I'm coming right back up where I started. So I come a 1/4 of an inch away and stitch back to my foundation stitch. This time what we're going to do is to make an arc. You don't want the arc too big or you'll be tying knots for a long time. So just a nice little arc. Again, to make them all even, you can stick the tip of your scissors in there and pull against those to keep all your threads even. And guess what? We need to do this 3 times. So you're going to try to take these next two stitches exactly where you took this first one. So we're coming our 1/4 of an inch away and come up right where our foundation stitch is and pull all these guys down even. And one more. And now we have what I call our arcs, our little rainbows. You can see them kind of arcing up away from the fabric. This is going to be our thread eye, the foundation for it. So you are going to take the end of the needle, or the eye of the needle, you are going to send it underneath the arcs. Then the end that's secure, that you just came out of the stitch, goes over the top of the needle, and you pull the needle through that loop. Because we've got to make knots. So you can't just loop it around, that won't help us, but we need our knots. So the end of the needle underneath, the edge of the end of the thread over the top of the needle, and pull the needle, I got it, through the loop. So each knot should be right next to each other. We're going to cover our arc with knots. Pull them really tight underneath, put the thread over the top of the needle, pull through, and pull tight. And make sure they're right next to each other, not one on top of each other. Pull them really tight. You've got 4 threads here. You can pull pretty tight against it. And you're going to go all the way across the arc to the other side. Got to make sure you're still making knots. We get down to this side. Maybe one more. It's all getting twisted here. So we have knots all the way across. Then, if that's not enough knots, you're going to take one more little stitch here and finish this like we finished everything else. Make a tailor's knot, big circle, hold it down, and then stitch in between the layers. And clip off those threads and clip off your waist knot. So now we have a straight eye, we have a thread eye, and we have a curved eye. These all hook with the same hook. It looks like this. Oops, maybe it looks like this. So you've probably seen these before. The hook needs to sew to the other side of your bodice, right? We've just attached, you will have at least 2 different eyes for this same hook. So somewhere in the vicinity here, put these. We will be putting the buttonholes in class, obviously, with the sewing machine. Now the hook must hide underneath, right? We don't want to see any stitches on the right side of the garment with the hook, because that would be the front of your garment, and those stitches would be crazy. So it goes on the inside of your garment, and you want the fold of the hook to be just set back just barely from the edge of the front of your garment. That way you can close your garment, and it looks like it's just mysteriously closed, and you don't have any threads or any closures looking out. This is a more formal closure. Maybe you've used one at the top of a zipper on a dress or a formal, because we don't see the stitches on the outside of the garment, as opposed to a button or a buttonhole, which would be less formal, more casual, or tailored. Okay, so we're going to do, I'm stitching again with the same 4 threads. I'm going to make my dressmaker's knot for my waist knot. I'm going to come out here a 1/2 inch away, stitch in between the layers, and come up where I want the hook to go. I'm going to take my foundation stitch again. Now remember, if we're just stitching through this layer, we're stitching through the facing, and the facing piece has the interlining on it, so it has all the strength that we need. Now I'm going to go up through this eyelet. Only on the button do you go in between eyelets. On everything else, we want to stitch in the eyelet to the outside. And we're going to do this until we have 12 threads in this eyelet. And none of my stitches are coming through to the front of the garment. Then on that third stitch, what you can do is stitch in between the layers and come up where you need to stitch the other eyelet. Make sure all those threads are with you. And go through this eyelet 3 more times. On my last stitch, what I'm going to do is stitch up beside the hook. Again, trying not to go in between, or going in between the layers, not hooking the front. What I'm going to do now is to stitch what I call the bump. And it might be really hard to see the bump, and usually the first stitch is kind of difficult. But you can wedge your needle underneath the middle metal part that kind of bumps up. The bump is what holds the eye in. The reason why we stitch through this bump is so that the end of the hook is held in place. Maybe you've had one that you've bought and they didn't stitch the end of the hook down, and so it's kind of floppy. If our whole point is to hook this edge of the fabric to this edge, the other fabric, then we need that held in place. So you're going to go through the bump and then in between the layers, back around to the other side, again not stitching on the front, and do that 3 times as well. This way, that stays secure and holds your garment where you want it. We're going to do it till we have 12 threads. After the first stitch, it gets a little bit easier, but especially if you're using a bigger needle, this will be kind of difficult at first. So now I have 12 threads through that as well. I'm going to take my little stitch here, do my tailor's knot, hold it down, oops, and then I'm going to stitch between the layers. Out close to my waist knot. Again, no stitches on the front side. And clip all of this off. So we have a hook that can hook with this curved eye hanging off. It can overlap and hook with a straight eye, or it can hook more securely with a thread eye, either being straight or hooking off the end. The other kind of hook and eye we will use is called a waistband hook and eye. This is obviously used at the waistband. It can be used on a trouser or on a skirt. This creates a more refined look because we have no stitches on the front side of the garment. It is an overlapping kind of closure. There is no closure that hangs on and it lets the two abut. This is sometimes, instead of called an eye, sometimes you'll hear it called a waistband trouser hook and bar. It sews on similarly to everything else we've been stitching. So you take your waist knot out about a 1/2 inch, stitch in between the layers to where we want to put this on. From here, you're going to do your foundation stitch. And then we're going to start stitching. Now you'll note that the bar is kind of shaped so that it will have space underneath. So make sure you're stitching it on so that it bends away from the fabric. So come up through the eyelet, and what I want you to make sure you do is stitch from the inside of the eyelet to the outside. In other words, not in between eyelets. This is because, and again, if you take a little bit of stitch on the back side, I'm not so worried about that. I do want you to get the interlining to make sure it's secure. I want you to stitch to the outside of each eyelet so that if one of these threads just happens to break, you will have the other eyelet to hold everything together until you can get home or get to a place where you can get it fixed. So once I've done my 3 stitches in the one eyelet, I just stitch in between the layers to the other eyelet. Yeah. Now we've got a whole bunch of things on here to hook up. And again, another 3 stitches here. So the stitches that we practiced at the beginning of the semester, the running stitch where we went in and out in one stitch, will be helpful here if you mastered it then. I just hook that button every time. Make sure all your threads are with you. Now that I have this end secure, I'm going to take a really big stitch in between the layers. So instead of on the back side here, maybe, and come up where I want to stitch these eyelets. So again, I'm coming up through the eyelet to the outside of the garment. And this time I go in between the layers to create my 3rd stitch, and 3 stitches over here. So we want closures to stay on, and we want them to stay on no matter what until we get home. These metal closures can sometimes be tough on the thread. Once you take your final stitch out, then you take your small stitch out here, do your tailor's knot like we have been doing, and then take your last stitch in between the layers to hide those threads. So I'm going to clip that off and clip my waist knot off. So now my bar or my eye is on. Again, it's going to correspond with this waistband hook. The hook's job, just like the metal hook, is to hold this edge of the fabric down. If you have worn any slacks, then it probably has this because it has a, you want a more formal look. Or maybe some dress slacks that you've worn to work might have this kind of closure. So once again, I have my waist knot and I stitch my foundation stitch. On this one too, this particular one has 2 eyelets on the side. Sometimes they just have 1. But once again, we want to go into the eyelet to the outside. 3 stitches and then move over. And this time, the stitches cannot come through because this is the front of your garment. When you're switching from one eyelet to the next, just stitch in between the layers. And then we're going to come up, so I'm stitching in between the layers to move to the next eyelet. In this particular hook, there's 5 eyelets. Like I said, sometimes there's only 3. But you want to make sure you stitch through each eyelet to the outside. Again, in between the layers. And you might be noticing as I'm doing this, I'm flipping it over all the time to check and make sure my thread is where I want it and I haven't stitched down something I didn't intend to. I catch things, and I've been doing this for a very long time. So don't feel bad if you have to undo a stitch or two, or if you stitch something you didn't intend to. Just take it out and go again. This is a skill that you don't learn in one semester, let alone one little sample. So we're just practicing. We're trying to get it the best we can get it. And have a good example for you to refer to as you move on. Alright, so I'm going to finish that with a little stitch on the outside. Tie my knot. And then I'm going to stitch in between the layers to hide those threads. Clip everything off and you're good to go. Oh, well, that one doesn't want to go off. So this is what it should look like on the inside of your garment. It corresponds to the bar that it would hook over, overlapping. Our last item to sew on is a snap. And snaps are kind of loose closures. They're not the most secure. Some snaps are definitely stronger than others, but in general they're not thought to be as strong of a closure. They're on a snap, you have the ball side and a socket side. So make sure when you're sewing them on, you have one side protruding and one side that's ready to accept that, or we won't be able to snap. This closure for this sample can overlap. The ball side is usually on the left-hand side or sitting away from you, so that the socket side is coming at your body. Similar to what we discussed with the Velcro on your pincushion. Exact same way of application as we have been doing it. So waist knot in between the layers, and again on the left-hand side, this is on the front of the garment. Do your foundation stitch. Now, just like we've been talking about, there's 4 eyelets in this sew-on snap. So we want to make sure that we're stitching each one to the outside. So through the eyelet to the outside. Yep. Well, I've got a loop here and I need to figure out where it is. Sometimes if you pull on the loop, it'll pull the thread that it is a little bit tighter and you can find. Okay, now I have 3 in that eyelet, so I'm going to go in between the layers and come up where the next eyelet is. Remember when I spoke to you about the supplies, I mentioned beeswax. If when you are doing these stitches you are having a really hard time with your threads, what you can do is get some beeswax, or come ask and I can let you borrow some, and you run your thread through it and then heat it up under the iron. This gives your thread a little more structure. It's kind of like a temporary finish, maybe you talked about in textiles. It makes the thread stronger and a little more, it mines better, I guess we'll say. Stays together a little bit better, has more texture. So that is absolutely a possibility if you need. So 3 to the outside. So it will look like that. Again, if one of those threads breaks, you're not sunk because they're all stitched separately. I'm going to take my little stitch on the outside, tie my tailor's knot, and take my stitch in between the layers. Cut both your waist knot and your threads off. And this side, the left side of your sample, is now complete. For the right side, we must sew the socket on. Now remember, on this side it has to be dipping under so that it can accept the ball side. So it seems a little bit odd sometimes. We're going to do our foundation stitch out here. Remember, none of these stitches on this side, on the right side, can go through to the front of the garment, or we'll have crazy threads on the front of our garment. So make sure you're just stitching through the facing and the interlining. So again, I'm going to come up through an eyelet, and I'm going to stitch that eyelet down 3 times. Now I keep my finger back here on the right side of the garment to feel for the stitches. And if I poke my finger, then I know that my needle is poking through to the right side of the garment, and that's not what I want. This is all, again, don't try to make it so crazy difficult, but think about the garments that you wear. You don't have stitches on the front side when you have the hooks and eyes, so you don't want them on your sample either. And as we've talked about in class, when we see more stitches, that means that it's a much more tailored or casual garment. So in general, there's some very elaborate buttons, but in general, buttons and buttonholes are considered a little more casual kind of garment. But the snaps are more of a functional thing, right? Some of them are just when you need an easier closure, but they're, again, not typically as strong as some of the other closures that we've had today. In between the layers to my last eyelet. Three stitches, take my little stitch out here, tie my knot, and then we're going to stitch in between the layers to hide our threads. Clip off both those threads and the waist knot, and the hand stitching is done on this side. Depending on how class went, you will have 2 vertical buttonholes and 2 horizontal buttonholes here to correspond with the buttons that we sewed on the left side. So your finished garment will look something like this. So again, buttons, and we'll have corresponding buttonholes. And then we have the metal eye. And for the metal eye, you have 2 options. You will have either the curved eye or the straight eye, and you will have the thread eye. All 3 of these hook with the metal hook. You will have a trouser or a waistband hook and bar, or hook and eye, and you will have a snap.